doing a little package, and then it's us.
Don't forget to keep your voice up a little bit, James.
Good afternoon. My name is James Cunningham. I'm the editor of Australian Cinematographer magazine. And part of Broadcast Brains at SMPTE 2017, I'm here with a legend. A man who started work in 1963 for the ABC, and a storied career of 37 awards for cinematography out of 52 nominations, including 5 Oscar nominations for Witness, Rain Man, The English Patient, Cold Mountain, and Mad Max, including the Oscar win in 1997 for The English Patient. John Seale, welcome to Broadcast Brains.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So I only have an hour to talk to you, John. I can't get through 43 films in that time, but if it's all right, I'd like to pick 10. I'd like to start in 1983, a film called Goodbye Paradise. You won the Millie Award, Best Cinematographer of the Year, 1983 for Goodbye Paradise, a dystopian look at politics in Australia. Quite topical. What did you think when you first got the script, and how did you approach filming it?
Gosh, that's a long time ago, but it was a very, very interesting script, to say the least. It came out of the blue of a filmmaking process in Australia that in fact was very formal. We were making very good formal films. And then suddenly Carl Schultz and Bob Ellis, the famous Bob Ellis, came up with this film, Goodbye Paradise, which was outrageous in fact, with its general idea of Queensland becoming militarised and breaking away from the rest of Australia. Was just an unheard of subject matter back then. So apart from the fact that at that stage of my career I was grabbing every job that was made available, there was no ability to choose, I did love the idea of this breakaway script and went to Queensland to make it, and it really was a wonderful, wonderful experience. Carl Schultz was a wonderful director to work with, very calm, very collected, worked on his actors very nicely, and really put together a package that I thought was should have been very appealing. But there were a lot of people who saw the film on release and felt that it was ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous, that Queensland would become militarised and in fact break away from the rest of Australia. And I think that in the long run, I think people found it years later, found the value of that madness of life and politics and military or whatever, and the madness of people that were involved in that as well. And it took a while, but I think to this day it's one of my favourite films. It also, because I'd been taught and I was learning cinematography in a very formal manner, that most of my mentors back then, because there were no film schools, so the mentors back then were cameramen that you happened to work with, would tell you how to light something. And it was always the formality of a key, fill and a backlight. So if you didn't have that, you didn't have a good close-up. And things like, and you know, you had to have fixed lenses, zooms weren't in. They didn't have the quality of a fixed lens. So everything in the shooting of the film was wrapped around the formality of cinematography. But it was Goodbye Paradise, and the way it was written, the subject matter, and I realised that my approach had to be in essence the same as Bob Ellis's approach to formal script writing. Throw it out the door and make a film of interest. So that after that film, I found that my technical ability, I felt, had reached a zenith. And from that day on, that movie on, I actually then, I think, started to make better films as a cinematographer. I started to make the film as a cinematographer rather than shoot the film as a cinematographer.
As a cinematographer and a director of photography, there's a fine line between the technical side and the artistic side. Would you then say it would be right to say on Goodbye Paradise you embraced more of the artistic side than the technological side?
I found it about halfway through. I found that My tiny brain had analysed how to use light meters, the balance of a film negative emulsion to the light meters, to light falling on the subject matter and the way the camera then recorded it. And I had it down to a T in my brain. So I felt that I'd reached a technical point and moment that was satisfactory for me to shoot films. And then I realised, through the influence of Bob Ellis, Carl Schultz, the nature of the film, of Goodbye Paradise, I should now be making movies and not worry so much about that technical piece of equipment called the camera. So I actually got a little bit the other way at times. I became totally in disregard to the mechanics of how to shoot a film. I was more interested in the film.
But you won Australian Cinematographer of the Year for that film. So you were doing something right. In 1985, Witness came to you. Now, you'd worked with Peter Weir before on Last Wave and Gallipoli, but not as a cinematographer. When did Peter Weir, or how did he actually pitch you this film, Witness? And did you have to interview for the actual film?
No, I didn't. In a way, it came about very quickly. It came about because the first film in going to America with Peter was Mosquito Coast, and it came up very quickly. And to be honest, Russell wasn't available at that stage, and I think that he felt that as Russell's camera operator, I had been shooting films in Australia and had won awards. So I think he felt that my expertise at being a cinematographer, a director of photography, was sufficient. And without the availability of his normal cameraman, he asked me would I be prepared to do it. And of course I jumped at it. Peter was a wonderful, wonderful director, and I wasn't going to miss out on anything that he offered. We went to America. We set up Mosquito Coast in Belize in Central America. But as with a lot of early American films, it crashed. The finances were suddenly pulled, and we were told to go home very quickly, just get out of the country before the money runs out, and go home. So I was home for about 6 or 8 weeks. And Peter rang again and said, I've got another film to do. It's going to happen very quickly. Can you leave in 2 weeks and go back to America? And I had, 3 commercials, and I cancelled those. I said yes. I cancelled those. And 2 weeks later, I was on a plane to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to start Witness. And that was frightening.
So this was your first Hollywood film outside. How different, especially in the 1980s, was shooting a Hollywood, an American film, compared with shooting Australian films?
Frightening, terrifying. Because all of a sudden Harrison Ford was Mr. Box Office in America at that stage with Indiana Jones, and he was just #1 box office. And it was frightening to suddenly realise I was there amongst a whole team of American crew who in my mind were highly professional. And here I was from Australia, the outback and in shorts. And there's Mr. Box Office in front of the camera. Suddenly you just get overawed, or I did. And about a week in, I didn't bottle, but I got very nervous, and I just said to Peter, I said, look, I'm sorry, but I don't think I'm doing this right. Because one of the crew said something to me that he felt that an American cameraman would have done it a different way. And I didn't agree with that way, but then I suddenly lost control, and I thought maybe I am doing it the incorrect way. But Peter, just being very wise, Peter said, Johnny, look, regard this as an Australian film. It's just that most of the crew have a funny accent.
It's a wonderful quote.
And I was right as rain after that.
And Mr. Box Office, Harrison Ford, received his only Academy Award nomination in his entire career for that one film.
I believe so, yeah.
There's a wonderful quote about Witness. I'd like to read it. There is not a wasted or unnecessary shot in Peter Weir's Witness. Like the great barn raising in the late second act, the film's construction is both efficient, unhurried, functional, and beautiful. That's from Stephen Gray Danis. Talk about the barn dance scene, if you remember
The which, sorry?
the barn dance scene. Kelly McGuinness
Yep.
twirling in the headlights of the car while a song by Tim Cook is playing. The song to book Harrison Ford's character was 30 years old, but to Kelly McGillis's character, the song is brand new. It was a beautiful scene. John, that scene has earned a spot in the American Film Institute's 100 Scenes of Passion. How do you shoot a scene like that? Where does it come from? Was it storyboarded?
No, there's a funny story about storyboards on Witness. I think on the first day shoot, I think we were both quite nervous. Me more so than Peter, I think. But the nervousness came out in a funny kind of a way that in the car on the way to work, first day, let's do storyboards. So I drew stick figures. Peter said, I think we need a wide shot there of the barn. We'll do this. We'll cut into a close-up maybe there. And I'm drawing like mad and then a reverse on another little stick figure drawing. We get to location. The car stops. We both got out both sides of the car, and I remember Peter stood up, and I stood up, looked over the roof of the car, and Peter said, Johnny, tear it all up. That's how we're not going to do it. Mm. And I thought, wow, that's so interesting. In other words, get rid of the first instincts of your mind and dig deeper into the second and the third and the fourth layer of how you want to handle the camera and record the film.
So do you think storyboards help or are a hindrance while you're shooting?
Oh, well, there's some films that have to be storyboarded. Big action films like Perfect Storm or Poseidon, you have to have them so that visual effects, stunts, on-set action has to be all programmed for safety or whatever. So you have to have storyboards. But other films...
Like Witness?
Yeah. Often is a what-if system. Hey, what if we shoot it from here and then he can come out of the dark or whatever. So they're a what-if system. So I think it was a bit of a jolt in my nervousness at the beginning of Witness to suddenly have the storyboards, which would have then become my Bible of shooting, have to tear them up. Now I didn't know where I was again. And so we shot it as a what-if system. And I think it worked very well even with that. Yeah.
In 1986, you shot Rhonda Haines' first feature film, Children of a Lesser God. The film went on to win, nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including Best Actress for Marlee Matlin. How did that film come to you, and how was it originally pitched to you?
I got that. It was offered up through my agent. Obviously, you have to have an agent in America. The thing about that film was that I had never heard of the director or the actors or the actors at that stage. And I read it, and it was most interesting because it was about the hearing of people and very intense. And I didn't mind those kind of films at all. I quite liked them. So I liked the script, but I wanted to know who was in it. And when I heard that William Hurt was going to play the lead, that was a big influence because right at that time, and in fact during the shooting, he was nominated and garnered an Academy Award for Kiss of the Spider Woman. So I already knew that Bill was a consummate actor and would bring an awful lot to the character in our film. And so I accepted it on that grounds, in fact. And that's helped a lot of the way I accept the film is I really love to know what actors are in it that have accepted that part, which would then make lift the film into a nice level.
There was an amount of underwater photography on Children of a Lesser God. Was it the first time you were working with underwater cinematography?
No, I had done over the years a little bit. I wasn't certified by any means. And our producer, typical American system back then was the producer said, Well, we'll have to get an underwater crew to do that. And I looked at the director and I had a very good idea that director would love for us to do it, to keep it in the family. So I just said to him, I said, no, I'd love to do it. We can do that. It's in a pool, be perfectly safe. So we actually ended up doing it. We did the whole underwater stuff. And I think that both Bill and Marley felt a lot more comfortable when they had to go naked in the pool. I think they were much more comfortable knowing that it was the family group shooting them, not some other guy who came in for an underwater unit.
How did you choose your technology and your camera technology shooting film underwater?
Fairly simple. We basically used the film negative and the cameras that we normally use above water and just have special housings that are built and available. We put those in. One of the big problems with shooting that was the bubbles from our aqualungs. We didn't want those bubbles going up to the surface and being shown on the surface. So our underwater divers who were there to help us organised what they call a bypass system, and we grabbed air from a hose that was continually blowing air past us and out of the pool, out above the water. So a normal bottle might last 45 minutes underwater. They were lasting about 5 minutes in the tank because we were grabbing the air as it went past rather than taking what we needed and expelling it. So we used a lot of bottles, but that was cheap. We just got dozens more in and kept shooting.
It's a beautiful film. In 1986, you then went to Belize, finally, working with Peter Weir again and Harrison Ford. Humidity in Belize, did that affect filming?
Humidity does affect some people. I love it. I love the heat and humidity. Okay, it's nice to work into it slowly, climatise as you go. Hitting it head on is a bit rugged. With the actors, it's a little worse because they're playing somebody else. They're in a foreign part, and I think that sometimes their wardrobe as well is not built for the humidity, so they might sweat up a little more than normal. With cameras, we're a little more careful with what we do with the cameras overnight when it goes cool. You can get condensation on the cameras or within the lenses, possibly. So we have to climatise them constantly over 24 hours. But otherwise, that's about it, apart from the snakes.
You tested 3 types of film stock prior to shooting Mosquito Coast in Belize: Kodak, Agfa and Fuji. Fuji won, I believe. Why?
That's right. Back then there were 3 negatives, and they all recorded images in a different tonal colour and contrast basics. So when we came to do Mosquito Coast, Peter didn't want a lovely green, welcoming jungle. If I remember, his words were, "I want a black, greasy jungle that nobody would ever go into except Ali Fox." So we tested all 3 negatives. The Agfa negative was beautiful, and they were using it in other films for jungle films because it had beautiful rendition of greens and made jungles look very, very pretty. Kodak was, as usual, clean, crisp, a bit cold, a bit blue, but the Fuji was ugly. It didn't like the greens, and it really went to an olive green, and the blacks were really lovely blacks. Well, that's exactly what Peter was looking for, and immediately that's it. That was the negative. So that negative was used on that film. Later on other films in the jungle, I used the Agfa because it was a prettier jungle, i.e. Gorillas in the Mist, because that had to be a very beautiful jungle to convince the audience. That's why Diane Fossey was there as well as the gorillas.
That's my next film I'd like to talk about. 1987 saw you off with Sigourney Weaver as Diane Fossey in Gorillas in the Mist. The studio originally spoke of men in gorilla suits, but you ended up working with real gorillas. How did that happen, and what was that experience like?
Oh, that was wonderful. That was Michael Apted, our director, who had been into Africa, had seen the real gorillas, and quite honestly said, that's where we shoot the movie. There's no way in the world we can convince an audience that men in gorilla suits was going to be real. So it would lose a lot of value on the emotion of between Dian Fossey and the gorillas. A very bold move. The studio continually trying to talk him out of it right up until the time we started shooting in Rwanda, to go into the studios, to do it like the Tarzan movies and just dress people up. We watched that, of course, Michael and I, and we both agreed that they looked like men in suits. So that wasn't going to work. And my respect for him in his boldness to actually go in amongst the real gorillas is still beholden today, because it made the film that he made and brought the audience so close to understanding what Dian Fossey was all about. So it was difficult, very difficult to shoot real gorillas, and we were trained how to handle the gorillas, how the gorillas would handle us, how we would, like in the film, have to hit the dirt, grab a piece of greenery and look as though we're eating, and make comforting noises if he charged us, because they were actually scared of us. Those great big silverbacks are actually very timid, and all they want to do is get you out of there. Why don't you get out of my tree? This is my tree, go away. So they do all of this and make a big noise, tear down trees, then they look around, oh, they're still there. You know, that's all they wanted to do, was to get rid of you. So they're actually very timid. So that we had to play that timidness to them if they showed aggression. We're all right, you know, we're out of your way, we're lower than you. You never stood up, because a gorilla standing up is aggression. So we always hit the dirt. We're lower, you know, and we were timid, out of their way. So that was the way we played it. So
1988 saw Rain Man by Barry Levinson, great director, but Barry Levinson wasn't the first director to bring you Rain Man, is that right? It was brought to you by Sidney Pollack originally. How was that first pitched to you by the two directors, and was there a difference in their approaches?
Totally. The difference between them was total. The first request for a meeting was through my agent with Sidney Pollack. Very nervous, because Sidney was a big Hollywood man and highly respected. So I was very nervous, went into it. And Sidney was a very bombastic man, very much his own man. So his confidence was very much in evidence right from the moment you meet him, that he is the filmmaker. That's all there is to it. So he's but for an hour he told me about how he was going to make the film. And then he suddenly stopped and he said, now you tell me all about you and how you would approach this film after what I've told you. So I had to then open up about it, which I did, and afterwards the producer said, couldn't believe it. He said, at the end of when he thought that you'd said enough, he said, well, thank you very much for coming in, and that's your cue, get up and leave quickly. So I left, and he said, we can't believe it. As soon as the door closed, he said, get him, book him, that's it. Which was lovely. But there was a writer's strike, and Sidney wanted to do a lot of rewrites off the original script, and he couldn't do them because of the writer's strike. So for his own reasons, he bailed out. Barry Levinson took over. Normally when American directors change on a project, they get rid of the cameraman as well. And I fully expected that, except that my agent rang and said, Barry Levinson wants to ring you, would like you to stay on to the movie. I said, well, I'd love to stay on. So I had a little talk with Barry on the phone, and he just said, I'm taking it back to the original script, which I had read. And I like that original script, which is the movie. I like that. So I said, I'd love to help you make it. So that was the interview. And that was it. I just flew over and did my pre-production and shot the movie.
Tom Cruise and Dustin Hoffman, two big names. You'd worked with big names in Hollywood before, but what kind of considerations do you have to work with in working with these big Hollywood names? And was this the first film that you'd shot with more than one camera?
Rayman was, because it was under a writer's strike. The actors, they couldn't rewrite scenes that they wanted to play, say, the next day. So if it was written on a serviette in a restaurant and thrown in the garbage bin on the way out so there was no evidence, it was ad-libbed. So it was halfway through the movie on a particular scene of counting toothpicks on the floor. The dumbo me from Australia realised that they were ad-libbing. And I was horrified because we had one camera on Dustin. And I thought, we've got to have another one on Tom, otherwise the ad-libbing is going to be a nightmare to try and go back to the sound man, play it all through. The actor will now have to learn the ad-lib lines so it matches. And I went over to Barry and I said, Barry, we should be doing two cameras on this. We should be... He said, I wasn't game to ask, because Hollywood wasn't doing it then. Hollywood was a one-camera, prime lens type of shooting. So I said, give me 3 minutes and I'll put another camera in. And from that day on, I've shot multiple cameras because it works so well.
That's right, it wasn't your last film with more than one camera, but in 1989 saw you shoot Dead Poets Society, back with Peter Weir and the late Robin Williams. What was it like to work with Robin Williams' energy on set?
Fantastic. Robin was his brain is so fast. He always wanted to make people laugh. If they weren't laughing, he would start a one-man show in the middle of the set and he would be hilarious about anything. He was amazing, absolutely amazing. But an absolute delight to work with, because Peter kept him in tight control. Otherwise he can become his own director or his own writer or whatever, and push that character into the film which wasn't written. So Peter had a tight leash on him, and he was very respectful because, he'd be going on about a joke and telling stories, and Peter would suddenly say, all right, let's go, come on, we've got a movie to make. And he'd say, yes, boss, yes, okay, boss. And he'd sit down and he'd play that part, and he did it beautifully.
And you shot the film very quickly, one take, and then you would move on, is that right?
Dead Poets was shot, very quickly, and minimum number of takes. Peter was adamant about that. If an actor wanted another take, they had to have a very good reason to go again. I had minor troubles with the focus puller that he'd been on Rain Man, where we'd do 30 takes. So if they blew the focus on one, it doesn't matter, we'll do another 28 takes. But on Dead Poets, I kept warning them at the beginning. Even I didn't know how fast we were going to move. But I kept warning the focus pullers at the start, we will move along very quickly on this. But he couldn't handle it. The first AC could not handle it. So I had to take him outside and say, calm down, I've warned you about this. This is the way it's going to happen. You can do it. If you want another rehearsal, you'll get a rehearsal. What Peter doesn't want to do is burn the actors out doing take after take for technical reasons. And that's where I learnt another thing about making films, is to give the actors perfect control on the set. It's their set. And we as technicians should make sure that every shot, that as we shoot it, is 100% for them. That we don't say, oh, look, I had a little... Because I used to do it when I in the early days, as an operator. Oh, I had a bump in the middle of that, we'll have to go again. Everybody believed me because they couldn't see a monitor. But now they have a monitor, they can see the bump. So, but I learnt that I've got to, as a cameraman and an operator, you've got to give them all the room that they can get.
Amazing. Uh, 19...
That's very loud.
Pardon?
That's very.
Design, interactive activity, and the staff and how they were
Just to interject, John,
when they were doing their judging.
They should warn you about that.
they should.
Congratulations to all exhibitors. However, our winner of the best larger stand is
Is it all right? Do you want it looser?
No, it's perfect.
2017 was G Technologies.
1992, a film called Lorenzo's Oil. Can you talk a little bit about the colour fading throughout the motion picture and the purpose, obviously, for the colour fading throughout the film, but also how easy that would be today to complete with modern technology and a modern DI. But then you were doing wet gate printing, is that right?
Lorenzo's Oil came out of the blue with George Miller, and it was fantastic watching George's brain work on that film, because it's a very complex little story, very emotional little story of a family and a small boy who's dying, and a family who won't give up. And George was going to make the film as hard emotionally as the parents were going through within their real life, their real situation. He wanted the movie to be as hard hitting, and he wasn't going to let up. He's going to make sure that the audience watching it would sweat through it just as much as the parents were. And one of his lovely, fantastic ideas was, as the boy is diagnosed and starts to die, basically, he was going to strip the colour out of the film. I forget, it was over about 50 odd minutes, I think. He would reduce to black and white. Mm-hmm. So when the boy was at his ebb, it'd be hard, stark black and white. And then when they find the oil that enables him to keep living and not degenerate as quickly, it would blossom back into colour, I think, over 17 minutes of screen time. And I thought this was such a fantastic idea.
It is.
But it was so complex in the film Negative Days to be able to do that subtle desaturation from full colour to black and white on film through wet gate printing. Try to then, I'd gone off on another film, keeping in contact with George, and George saying, I've done 2 reels and they're not too bad, but they were massive problems of reprinting to try and get the subtlety of the change.
Yep.
And in the end, the studio, I believe, said to George, we need the film, get it over here, that's it. So George just struck a colour print and took it over, and that was accepted in full colour.
Amazing.
Today you could do that so easily now on Today. And I said to George on Fury Road, would you ever do a remake of it? You do the original desat in the middle. Oh, he said that'd be a good idea. I don't know whether it'll happen or not, but I'd love to see it because it was a great idea.
It was. In 1993, you finally got to work with Sidney Pollack on The Firm. Were you electrocuted on that set?
Was I?
Electrocuted.
I was zapped, good and proper.
Were you?
Oh yeah, no.
What happened?
I've always been a bit too hands-on, and American unions don't like it at all. And of course, I was working with first time with a gaffer from New York called Mo Flam, lovely man, and he was nervous. It was on the first day that I got electrocuted, and it was 240. Normally, American systems are 120. But these lamps were 240. They'd come across from LA to Pittsburgh. And it seemed that in the truck travelling over, they'd rattled and things had undone and wires were touching. And of course, I earthed it and got zapped. And I bit my tongue very badly. The lamp came over and hit my ear and tore the top of my ear off. So I was standing there with blood pouring out of holes in my head. And Sydney thought that was it. But I went to hospital and they checked me out and left somebody with me all night to make sure I didn't die during my sleep, I think it was. And I went to work the next morning.
Amazing.
I was talking funny, because the tongue is... But
following
yes,
year, good to see you back. 1994, Beyond Rangoon, John Borman, story of Aung San Suu Kyi, Burmese democracy leader. You've said in the past you'd always wanted to work with John Borman. How did this film come to you?
well, out of the blue, this one. It certainly was a shock. I mean, I liked John's work. I loved it a lot. And it always crossed my mind that, gosh, I'd love to have a go with him, you know. And it just came out of the blue. Suddenly, I don't know, they never say why they've selected you or they want to have an interview. Most times the interviews are interesting. Sometimes they're not at all. They're a phone call. And this one was just a phone call. I think they judge your past films. They talk to other directors about what's he like. Does he got BO? Does he, you know?
Yeah.
And they say, oh no. Is he fast? Does he work fast? Does he work well with actors? All that sort of stuff. So he just rang and I wanted to work with him. So I just said, thank you. I'd love to do it.
And now you couldn't shoot the film in Burma. Obviously, they wouldn't let you shoot Beyond Rangoon in Burma. So you shot it in Malaysia, but you had an Australian crew.
I did. Australian crews, over my time travelling around the world with different crews, American, English, European, Australian, Australians are the best travellers. They put up with anything, really, and they'll accept and tolerate food and accommodation shortages or whatever, more so than most other countries. So I grabbed those, and I was told that I could bring them. So I just grabbed all the Australian crew and went over there and put it together.
Can you talk a little bit about the glass plates that you put together? You weren't working with CG, for example, in '94 and Beyond Rangoon, but you needed to add pagodas, for example, or fiberglass miniatures reflected into the lens. So you were adding pagodas into the shots in camera, is that right?
Absolutely, very old-fashioned idea, and I was into it at that stage, reading up on the smoke and mirrors era of filmmaking when that was the only way you could do it, using a 45-degree partially silver surfaced mirror, so that you had a reflected image from over there and a recorded image through it. And it's a brilliant idea of simplicity, of how to put flame all around somebody, how to make it look much more dangerous than it actually is. And so when John came on with his production designer and said, we're going to do glass shots with fiberglass models, I grabbed it because I thought, yes, this is fantastic. And CGI hadn't developed to the point where they could do that. So it was great to have a director who was going to grab it and embrace it and demand it, in fact. So we jumped into it, got our silver surfaced mirrors, and we experimented with it. Davey Burr, very well known, an Australian cameraman, came up to do second unit. Okay, Jono, he said, what have you got this time? I said, have a look at this, smoke and mirrors. And he grabbed it because a lot of it was his to shoot. So I showed him how we'd set it all up with blackouts. We could set it up, or if I remember, in 11 minutes. If suddenly the camera was set up, that's the background we want. We want a pagoda there, pagoda there, pagoda there, and a pagoda there in the background. Now, you can't cross it, of course, and you've got to make sure nobody crosses the mirrors. So in 11 minutes, we could set up the blacks, the pagodas, the actual mirror, and light it to match in about 11 minutes. So it was a fantastically fun way to shoot as well, and see it work.
1995, you worked on The American President with Michael Douglas and Annette Bening, a Rob Reiner film written by Aaron Sorkin, who went on to do The West Wing. What was it like to shoot Aaron's dialogue? You were working completely on sound stages for that film, is that right? And were you working with multiple cameras as well?
We were. I was always in multiple cameras from Rain Man on, yep. And I was adding more and more. You know, the more cameras I found that I could use, the happier I was. the American president, Rob Reiner, rang and he said, I want you to do the movie. And I was a little bit naively honest. I said, Rob, are you sure you want me to shoot it? And he said, yeah, why not? I said, well, I'm not American, and it's a very American show. He says, I'm not worried about that. Get over here and shoot it. I said, okay, I'm on my way. And it was fantastic. Michael Douglas, gem of a man to work with. Annette Bening, unbelievably fantastic to work with. They're so calm and casual and secure and confident in what they do, makes the on-set experience phenomenal. Because they like people, they can slip into their parts very quickly and easily. So their camaraderie with the crew was, and Rob Reiner's an amazingly funny man, very loose, very calm, he can blow up though. Ooh, Rob Reiner he can crack the temper if he wants to. But overall, the shooting experience was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And to this day, I'm still wearing Michael Douglas's dinner suit that he wore as the president in the movie.
What a wonderful story. 1995, The English Patient comes to you. What was your first reaction when you got the script for The English Patient? What were your first initial thoughts? How am I going to turn this into a film?
Well, I had read the book from Michael Ondaatje, and it's a very thick, complex book, beautifully written. And then the offer to make the film came up. And I was shooting in New York, and the producer came up and said, John, what have you got in the future? What will you be doing next? I said, well, I think we're getting together The English Patient. Oh, said the producer, who is going to write the screenplay for that amazing book? And I said, well, I think it's Anthony Minghella, our director. And she said, I can't wait for it to come out because it is such a complex book. Once again, it was a phone call from Anthony, and I jumped a plane and went to Rome and met Anthony, and Stevie Andrews was there, great Australian first assistant director, great guy, and he was there, and we had a lovely chat, and we got on. By virtue of the fact that a director will sometimes not test you, but will ask you your opinion. How do you see the opening shot with the aeroplane? And quite frankly, you've got to have an idea. You're not a cameraman if you don't. So I said, well, I imagined the desert and the camera craning up and we see the wing and then the root of the wing and then the fuselage and then rebuild. He said, that's exactly what You're on the movie after that. How could you not be on the movie when the director says, that's exactly what I want? That's exactly what I want.
Do that.
Yeah. So that way it was no interview. It was just get on a plane, get over here. And then we sort of bonded with that discussion almost the first day. And then after that, we went off to make the film. And it was Anthony's third film. And so he was a little nervous in some avenues of it. But we got through those, and we had a great crew. Mixture crew from Italy, America and England, and all mixed in. And it all worked, I think, for Anthony and gave him the confidence to.
It is a wonderful film. Did everything go right on that film? Or were there things that didn't work, that you tried and didn't go as well as you'd hoped?
There's always that. On every movie there's something that doesn't go right. We had dreams of the desert being beautifully... because the desert is always the flashback memories of the romance, it had to be a very gorgeous sort of, in memory, a gorgeous scenario of desert and people and the a slightly slow motion feel to it. And the desert wasn't that. The desert was wet. So it went an awful ugly yellow that was sort of muddy yellow. But because digital intermediate was starting to come in, we found that we could tint the desert quite a lot warmer and yellower. Anthony had a lot of problems with the flashbacks. Would the audience know when we'd left Italy in the present to Africa in the past? And was terrified that we'd have to put supers on. Meanwhile, back in the desert. Meanwhile, back in Italy. Meanwhile, back in the... He didn't want to do that, and I agreed totally. And we ummed and ahed and tried to work out how to do it. He had some pretty amazing ideas of building sets in the desert of the hospital room that we could see through the wall. But a couple of things happened which were fantastic. His editor, who was Walter Murch, top editor, ended up putting in 48 frame dissolves, which by even the standards back then was very, very slow. But they were perfect for the movie. He found those. We found that in the grade, I was able to take the colour out of the warmth out of Italy in the present and add it into the desert. And it was the combination of the long, slow dissolves that said to the audience, you're now going back and back and back and back, into the desert, and the colour shift. And Anthony found that in the edit later when I went over to do the answer print, he said, no, I think it's working. If we get that colour right, we'll be right as rain. And he was right up until then, was he happy that it would work for an audience.
When you were shooting that film, did you in your wildest dreams think that you would win the Oscar, the
No.
Academy Award for that particular film as you were shooting it?
No, never. I had lovely opportunities to make nice pictures, but that happens on every movie. I mean, to get nominated in those earlier days was a heck of a surprise. Because they make them at 5 a.m. in the morning in Los Angeles, it's midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning in Australia. We didn't even bother setting the alarm in the early days. Americans would ring at 5 in the morning and say, John, you've been nominated. And I'd say, what for? And it just wasn't in our brain to think, we've got to get up and see if you're nominated. Later, yes, because, when you get up to your 5th nomination, you sort of feel to yourself, oh, gee, maybe something will happen here. But the early days, no. Not any film. I very sadly worked with one cameraman in Australia in particular who said to me, I was operating for him, and said to me, I'm only doing this to win an award. And I remember thinking, where is your brain when you as a cameraman are thinking that? You're here to make the movie, aren't you? And I was an operator then. I was still learning to get my brain together as to what sort of a cameraman would I be when I became one. And that was one thing that I've never forgotten. And I've lectured that. Don't ever think that. Because if you start thinking that, people won't tread a path to your door.
Did that person win an award for that film?
No.
I'd like to talk about 2 films simultaneously. 1999, The Perfect Storm, and 2005, Poseidon. Very similar films in some ways. Both boats on the water, getting into trouble. Both shot by Wolfgang Petersen. But in terms of coverage, how did you approach shooting both of these pictures? Were there similarities in shooting the two, or were you trying to differentiate Poseidon from what you'd done on Perfect Storm?
Yes, I try to make every film a brand new movie, is why I would often take 3 to 6 months off between movies. I would never go back to back. I did it once and hated it because the last film was still in my brain when I moved on to the new one. So I vowed after that to always take time off to clear that other film, so that when I went into the next film, it was a brand new film. It was almost, I tried to feel the first film I've ever shot. I know nothing. I have no style. I have no little secrets that I'll bring from that one onto this one. Clear the brain, start again. Sit and talk to the director, analyse what they want, what they see, because to me that's very important. They see the most interesting things about their movie. Some don't. Some leave it to you completely, which is interesting as well. So that's where you have to have your own idea. Those two films, no. The Perfect Storm, I'd read the book, Sebastian Junger's book, 18 months, 2 years before. And I spoke to my agent pretty well straight away and said, if you ever hear of somebody getting the money up to make that movie, I want to be there. And 18 months later, she rang and she said, are you standing or sitting? I said, I'm standing. She said, sit down. I sat down. She said, you've got Perfect Storm if you want it. I said, I take it. I don't care what it is, how much it is. Don't do a deal. Just take it. And I love doing every minute of it.
Yeah.
I'd met Wolfgang at Harrison Ford's agent's house at a party for Air Force One. And Diane Dreyer, the continuity girl, lovely New York girl, love her to death, was continuity on it. And she'd always been saying to Wolfgang, you've got to meet this John Seal, you've got to meet John Seal. So she invited me to this little party at Harrison's agent's place as her company. But I knew the editor, Richard Francis Bruce, Australian guy, and I knew Harrison very well after 2 films. So it was lovely to meet. And I met Wolfgang and bam, he just said, you're on it. And so I love doing it. I love doing that film.
And you've worked with him twice now, so
Yeah.
I think he likes working with you too. How many cameras were you shooting with on Poseidon?
Oh, Poseidon, we were going for 6 and 7 cameras. It was a very tough film for the actors. They were always in water, cold, up to their knees and deeper in water or swimming around. They were beaten up a lot. So I put in as many cameras as I could. Wolfgang embraced that completely. He loved it. And one scene which I've used often to show students how we use 7 cameras in a continuous run of a scene. And it was a long scene of about 3.5 minutes. And normally in America, you'd only do that in a day. Well, we had it done by lunchtime in all the wide shots, the medium shots and the close-ups, basically from all the one camera angles of the 7, all simply starting with wide angles, lenses. We shot it. Then we put medium lenses on and we shot the medium shots. Because Wolfgang is very much a comic strip type director for the visuals. The visuals he likes are the old traditional, which I learned as well, wide shot, medium shot, close up. You've got a cutting power in the editing room, which I've learned to grow out of very quickly, but it came back with Wolfgang because that's what he's comfortable with. So we did the wide shots, the medium shots and the close-ups. The actors all loved it because they could start the run at the beginning and do 3.5 minutes constant dialogue, bouncing off each other. If they did ad lib a little bit, it was carried on 2, 3, 4 cameras. So the editor had cutting power even though the ad libs occurred. All of it came together in my mind in making a much better film because the actors loved it, the actors ran with it, the editor loved it because he could cut continuity instead of cut for performance instead of continuity. The director loved it because he was getting all of the good stuff in half a day. And of course, the producers of the studio were rapt.
You'd been working with multiple cameras by then for years and on multiple films, and it sounds great, but was there any pushback by you embracing multiple cameras on motion pictures?
Yeah, there was. Unfortunately, a lot of people in the industry, when I started going into multiple cameras, more so in America, but a little bit in England as well, didn't like the idea at all. They were still in the attitude of one camera, prime lens, light it perfectly. And for somebody to come in and say, well, no, I'm cross shooting. I've got a camera in there on a profile 2 shot and I'm cross shooting 2 cameras. They didn't like that at all, because there one old, very traditional American cameraman came up to me one day in the clubhouse in America and said,
The ASC
so
clubhouse.
with these multiple cameras, you're prostituting your lighting craft. And I thought, oh my God, here we go. And I thought, yes, but only 20%. I never go past 20%. I'll go back to one camera if it's more than 20. He turned and walked away. He didn't want to continue the discussion, didn't want to hear about it. He didn't want to hear that a cameraman with ASC after their name would compromise his lighting in any way or form. But to me, that compromise was making a better film.
Absolutely. It's just a different way of doing it.
Yeah.
You said you'd read the book Perfect Storm before working on the film. Had you read Harry Potter prior to 1999?
Oh, no. No. That was very funny. The producer of Perfect Storm and Poseidon, Duncan Henderson, lovely guy. I was in England for my own reasons socially, but I was hooked up to possibly do a picture with Richard Donner in England. And I happened to be in the area, and I rang Richard in LA and I said, Richard, I'm in the south of England. Could I do some surveys while I'm here? Oh gosh, great. He said, I'll organise it. So we went out into the Midlands there and we did the surveys and whatnot. And then I got back to England, and I knew that Duncan Henderson was in London doing some other movie. So I rang him just to say g'day, really. And he said, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm in London. I'm on a plane tonight back to Australia. He said, do me a favour, and go, when you're at the airport, buy the book Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. I said, oh yeah? I'd heard about this vaguely. He said, read it. Chris Columbus is doing it, and he's proffered your name. Oh, so I read the book on the plane, non-stop. I mean, I think we all got a little bit run away with Harry Potter. Couldn't put it down. Read it before we got over India. And when I landed, I rang him straight back and said, very interesting, I'd love to be involved in that. He said, you're on it. That's all there was to it. I flew back and met Chris, and we got going on it.
And so there was at least a year's worth of pre-production on the Harry Potter films, is that right? And had they slated you for all of the films or just the first one?
No, the first one, well, I was kind of booked on the first one. It was a year's work for me, with pre-production of about 3 months, not only organising camera angles, and we were going to use up to 6 cameras. Chris embraced the multiple camera setup. And this is where I had another little bit of trouble in England with multiple cameras and zoom lenses. Operators that wouldn't be on a geared head, they would be on a fluid camera. And I said to them they'd be like newsreel cameramen or sports cameramen. They'd be on a fluid head. They'd have zoom control on the panhandle, shoot the film in a what-if system. What's going to happen next? And so there's a lot of organisation with that, but there was also masses of casting, filming hundreds of people for the cast. So it was a very, very busy time. And once we started shooting, we got over the little glitch of the traditional rubbish, you know, and I finally got them going on 4, 5, 6 cameras. And we got going on that. And I think Chris was so excited about how all of that ran on the first film. He asked us to roll over into the second one, but I had Cold Mountain to do with Anthony Minghella. I rang Anthony and I said, Anthony, how's Cold Mountain? He said, definitely next year, definitely. I said, oh, okay. So I went to Chris and I said, I can't. I promised Anthony we'd do
Cold Mountain.
And as usual in the film industry, Cold Mountain didn't go. And so I could have done the second one, but I went off and did Dreamcatcher, I think, in Canada or something. But so I lost out on the second one. So that's the anomaly of the game. I mean, these things happen and schedules and things collide and you just can't make it work.
But you did end up working on Cold Mountain, and then on 2009, your second last film, The Tourist, shot in Venice. It was actually a remake of a French film. How was The Tourist originally pitched to you? And what was it like filming in Venice?
Well, Venice is difficult. You have to do everything by water. You take the trucks away and put everything into a barge. But the Venetian crews that were there and the Italian film crew had worked in Venice more than enough times to know how to deal, and so it was no problem at all. In fact, it was no slower than working with trucks because they'd get the barges into our locations before 7 o'clock in the morning. Camera crews took everything off, grips and electrics worked, they knew what to do. So it didn't slow us down at all. But the film was a little difficult for night shooting because the canals have no available light. It's not like a brightly lit street in New York or Los Angeles or Sydney where you can use a modicum of available light and just boost in what you need for your actors. The canals of Venice have got no light. So we had to light a kilometre or kilometre and a half of canals to do a boat chase. We had to light the entire thing. So it was a little bit of a nightmare. But it was at a time in your life when you're realising fully that you work on the principle of what you can get away with, not with what you can't. So all through the film, you'll see our movie lights in shot. And nobody worries about them because they're lights. And it's night and the canal's lit. What's the problem? They've got to be lit somehow. And they look like normal street lights, you know.
On grading, some cinematographers have told me they've shot the film, producers can do whatever they like in the grade. Some cinematographers have given up work, paid work, to sit in on the grade. How important do you think the grade is to a cinematographer's work? And how did you approach the grade on The Tourist?
It's frighteningly important. The Tourist was film negative. So I was restricted then a little bit off the negative, but the DI was going through, the answer print was going through a DI, so a digital intermediate, which we had full control over then. But the DI's become a nightmare, I think, for a lot of cameramen in that a committee goes now, possibly. Because it's so instantaneous on a computer, the changes can be made instantaneously. So everybody loves being there. And I found that when I walked in the first morning, there were 8 people, 3 editors, the visual effects supervisor, assistants, everybody was there. And they all had something to say about what the picture should look like. And because as the cameraman, you haven't been there for 6 months of editing. You're the stranger now. Mm-hmm. So you they talk over the top of your head. And you say, but don't you think that's a little bit great? No, it'll be all right. And you are bulldozed out. In the second week, I was thrown out. Everybody was thrown out except for the director and the colourist. The director decided he wanted to learn how to do it. He wasn't going to learn in front of everybody. So he threw everybody out and did the film himself. And I was terrified because the way it was heading was very warm and chocolatey characters to the point where the flesh tones were going muddy. They were so warm, they were muddy. There was no sheen off the skin. This
is Johnny Depp and Angelina Jolie.
Yeah, and they had a reasonable amount of makeup, which doesn't help that final result. So trying to keep the skin alive was becoming much more difficult with this heavy warming of the image. And when I wasn't able to go back and argue that, I bumped into the colourist a couple of months later at the Academy Awards. I'd been nominated for something and I bumped into him. And I'd seen the film and it wasn't muddy.
Okay.
And I said, how did that happen? Tell me how it got back to being a reasonable image. And this man was so professional, and he said, I got worried about it. And he said, I said to the director, this is getting a bit out of control. Why don't we go back and have a look at the negative that the cameraman gave us and find what colour he's got on that. And they went back to my negative, put it up. Well, that looks all right. And he said, I graded the film to that. So that was a lovely little exercise in sensibility in a way, to go back to what the cameraman had put into the negative. But when you go to a digital negative, that doesn't mean a thing to me anymore. Because from Arri Raw, you put in a bit of a LUT to give the editor and everybody an idea of what you want, but it's only an idea. So then I think it's imperative that the cameraman be there to correct that to exactly what he feels was needed or demanded or required in the first instance. And that's becoming, I think, overall, just a bit of a nightmare for a lot of cameramen lately.
And on grading on Mad Max as well, how early on in the production of Mad Max did George Miller start to talk to you about the colours of the film and how it was going to look in the end result?
We talked about it while shooting. Our stills photographer would come over with ideas and he'd say, what do you think of this? And he had some great ideas. And we would go to George and have a little confab. George is very much the auteur director. He likes to have a control of every department in lots of ways. So he had a fairly good idea of what he wanted, but not necessarily while we were shooting. George knew and knows the value of the computer in post. And so I could see that it was going to happen in post. But you can't really go in there for 8 months every day, because George had his own DI computer, he had his own colorist. And he was working almost every day colouring material that came from visual effects or the editing, and then went up to visual effects and was graded, taken back to editing, recut in, and then later another grade. And George, I think, did change his mind on how warm or how yellowy the desert would look. He was adamant he didn't want a standard post-apocalyptic look, which is that desaturated grey, blue, black and white sort of feeling of the life has gone out of the planet.
But ironically, they've recently released a black and white version of the film.
They have. I haven't seen it. George didn't talk about it. I've had nothing to do with it. I'd love to see it.
So would I. I haven't seen it either.
Yeah, I'd love to see it.
So, John, finally, you're retired now. No more films?
That's right.
No more
I have.
films?
Well, I hope I have. The only outlet I have is maybe with George. I just left it with him. I said, George, if you don't think I'm too old, if you think I can help in some way, and you feel you'd like that help, we'll have lunch.
Sounds good. So you're waiting for his call. Last question, John. Without a film, the world is digital now, but film certainly hasn't died. There's a resurgence of film. But in a digital world, what now do you see as the role of the cameraman in that digital world?
I think it depends on how the director feels. Some directors are finding very much more power in being able to control the image, as well as his performance and editing and everything. And those directors are becoming more powerful by virtue of the digital revolution. Others, some I believe aren't. They're quite happy to leave it to the cameraman because their confidence is within that cameraman, within their talk, within their pre-production. There's a lot of variables in the game, because a lot of the time in pre-production you talk of a look. You go and shoot it with that look in mind and try to get your dailies, your work print as close to that look as possible. And then you leave the film and the director will go off with the editor for 6 months, 8 months, whatever, and be watching a dragged out awful print on a monitor And how many times the directors have fallen in love with that dreadful image, which is bright, overly bright, because the editor wants to look for microphones, sandbags. How many times I've walked into the DI suite, I've done my correction on reel one, show it to the director, and how many times they've said, stop here, this is not what I've been looking at for the last 6 months. And I say, no, damn, that's hell, you know, I don't want you looking at that other, this is what you should, this is what we talked about in pre-production a year ago. This is what you watched in dailies, near as damn it. And this is what I feel is what we talked about so far long ago, and now I've brought it back to that. The editing in between, and the one editor said, yep, I'm sorry, because the director turned to him and said, is this right? Is this what I've been watching, a pumped up, lousy image? And the editor went, yep. He said, I keep it bright to look for problem areas or whatever. So now I've printed it down to get the mood that we wanted and talked about and put into dailies. And suddenly that's alien to the director. So these problems, I feel, are becoming more and more as the directors move into being the total control of the image and the whole film. So I think on bigger budget films, I think cameramen may have a lot of problems with that post. On lower budget films, no, because they haven't got the money to alter things, change things, revamp things in post that they'd probably like to, but they haven't got the money. So lower budget, I don't think there's a problem. But high budget films, big action movies with big money, yes, I think the cameraman could run into a problem.
Good answer. John, it's been an absolute pleasure for you to let me pick your
thank you
brain
very
for the
much.
past hour. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been great.
Thank
It's
you.
been great. Good.